Now while I'm sure we're all hankering for some zombie spankering, I'd first like to talk about this video's sponsor, Opera GX. Whenever you find yourself face to face with a shambling horde, you need certain things: weapons, water, and of course, a lightning fast web browser. Tired of how Chrome or Firefox keeps slowing you down whenever you're trying to headshot a walker because they're gobbling up way too much of your PC's memory? Well, Opera GX has a survival tip called GX Control that'll let you reduce those memory-based stumbles and bumbles. And I know what you're gonna say. I get how my current browsers are holding me back, but I'm just so used to all my bookmarks and settings. Well, guess what? Using Opera GX's quick import tool, you can blast away that worry in a matter of seconds. And if you're into browser drip, GX Mods allows you to completely customize your background music, wallpapers, keyboard sounds, and a whole bunch more. Finally, there's GX Corner, which lets you stay updated on the current gaming release calendar, as well as your favorite YouTubers' most recent content, or even mine if you use this dedicated link you now see on your screen. You're gonna need the fastest and best web browser if you hope to survive the zombie hellpocalypse, and if you check out the link in the description or pinned comment below, you can do just that. Thanks again to Opera GX for the sponsorship, and without further ado, let's start the show. Hello and welcome to another brain-rotting, blood-clotting episode of What Happened, the show that tears right into the guts of some of the biggest, most arduous pop culture projects ever produced. On today's episode, we're finally gonna bash and slash through the story of one of the most infamous zombie video games ever made, one that limped its way through technically four main development studios, 2 generations of console hardware, and several game engines before it finally got to chow down on some juicy chess club quality brains. So grab your preferred zombie shredding instrument as I answer the question, what happened to Dead Island 2? Before we dig into today's story, I need to give a quick shout out to Game Informer's recent piece inside Yager Development's failed attempt to make Dead Island 2, written by Blake Hester. I myself attempted to speak to various development staff who were connected to this project over the last few weeks, but I was unfortunately only met with dead ends and NDAs. The Game Informer article was a critical resource for this episode, and it's no exaggeration to say it wouldn't have been possible to discuss the nitty and or gritty without it. I highly recommend giving it, linked in the description below, a read if you're so inclined. Anyway, it's not a hot take to say that the original Dead Island turned a lot of heads when its memorable CGI trailer dropped on a random Wednesday in February of 2011. Though the trailer featured absolutely no gameplay to speak of, its creative storytelling captured the imagination of press and gamers alike, even surprising Dead Island's developer Techland and its publisher Deep Silver. View counts for the trailer were crazy high. It eventually resulted in a legacy so enduring that the trailer even got its own Wikipedia page. So it's no question that this memorable bit of marketing was a big part of what helped Dead Island ship over 3 million units within mere months of its launch, and eventually sailing past 5 million only 2 years later. This far exceeded anything that Techland had shipped in the past, so they obviously shifted focus onto zombies to give the Juarez franchise a much-needed breather for a little while.
That's some good shit, man.
One team within Techland was then tasked to support Dead Island with post-launch content, which I'll get to a bit later, while another portion started concepting the sequel, which from the very get-go was going to be far more ambitious. Codenamed Dead World, they started to pivot away from the tongue-in-cheek approach they took with the original, instead choosing to hone in on more harrowing human drama. Now, as I stated before, almost everyone I reached out to was more than tight-lipped about Dead Island 2, with a few citing NDAs as the reason for their silence. Fortunately, the aforementioned Game Informer article comes in clutch here, as they were able to speak to a number of anonymous staffers, which in turn uncovered a lot of previously unknown details. The first of these sources worked at Techland, and on the subject of the Dead World version of the game, they stated, "I think we all kind of felt that we wanted to do something a bit more mature, especially as we started to dive into what zombies are really about. The thing about zombies is that they're just background, they're just kind of a trigger, a catalyst to observe how humans behave. Difficult times push people to show their true colors, and we thought that's why zombies are really interesting. When we started exploring the best comic books, the best movies about zombies that we liked, those are really stories about people, not zombies." In conjunction with this, Techland also wanted to expand upon the gameplay, implementing a parkour system that would allow the player to scamper and rebound off the environment to dodge the incoming hordes. This design proposal didn't last long though, because Deep Silver rejected it outright, saying it felt too far removed from the first game's tone and mechanics. Now typically, this is the point in a What Happened episode where I tell you that the developer initially put up a fuss before eventually compromising, with everyone winding up with a rushed, broken product at worst, or a safe, unmemorable sequel at best. But no, quite the opposite really. Techland believes strongly in their vision and were having absolutely none of Deep Silver's critiques, and it was decided that both companies would have to go their separate ways, with Deep Silver retaining the publishing rights to the franchise. That smaller team within Techland, who were supposed to be supporting the first game, then released Dead Island Riptide, which, if you'll recall, was not received all that well, with many complaining about the glorified expansion pack vibes, but coming in with a fat $50 price tag. Riptide was also widely criticized for failing to fix many of the rougher edges that were present in the first game, and generally bringing very little new to the table. It makes me wonder, tinfoil hat time, if Riptide was originally just meant to be a bunch of DLC content, but was instead folded into a standalone release to fulfill some contract obligation. And the game's premium Zombie Bait edition, which initially featured this thing, certainly didn't help the game's rep. Techland would then pitch their distinctly different zombie game idea elsewhere, which is something I'll loop around to later on, so keep it in the back of your mind, as it'll wind up being a pretty hefty L Deep Silver will need to hold down the line. For now though, they had the hottest property they had ever gotten up to that point, but the problem now was they had no one to develop it. According to the Game Informer piece, in early 2013, Deep Silver sent out a request to prospective studios to lobby for the job, who all basically lowballed each other to compete for the privilege to make a Dead Island sequel. While this practice is standard within several industries, it's still kind of gross, and leads right into the classic standoff that anyone familiar with commission work will recognize. A former Deep Silver employee elaborated on this process in the Game Informer article. They put out a request for proposal with an unrealistic budget, and then people bid on it knowing that there's no way they can complete it with the scope that's being asked for within the budget that's being allotted. And then they plan on developing enough up to the point where they need more budget, and you're too far along on the project to cut it completely, so you have to pay them more. It's the freelancer dilemma. What's your budget? Well, what's your rate? Well, what's your budget? Well, what's your rate? So it's that, but in the tens of millions of dollars. The initial development plan seems solid. Unlike Techland, Yager agreed with Deep Silver's desire to keep the same tone and irreverent sense of humor, so there were no issues there. The desire was to simply offer more of what the first game provided: online co-op, crafting and looting, killing zombies obviously, but set in a brand new location. The team decided to place the events of Dead Island 2 in several open-world maps across the environmentally diverse state of California, which isn't an island, and also to allow players to explore every single building, both inside and out.
Yeah, what's up? This Weezy Wee, and this Cash Money #1 stunner.
The game's art director described this version as the zombie apocalypse of your dreams. It was simultaneously a safe plan, appealing to Deep Silver's clear desire for an aesthetically similar sequel, but also a hugely ambitious one, as it expanded on all of the original game's ideas. It was clear that this was going to be a big project though, so the leadership at Yager smartly opened a new sub-company just to develop Dead Island 2, Yager Productions GmbH. The stakes, as you can see, were getting increasingly higher. As it occasionally happens in the world of game development, it seems that one singular decision became the linchpin to everything going right, or more accurately in this case, wrong, which was the switch over to Unreal Engine 4. At the time, this probably seemed like the right move, but it would ultimately create a lot of problems for Yager in the long run. Timo Ullman, Yager's managing director at the time, said in a press release that Unreal Engine 4 is, hands down, the best toolset for creating next-generation AAA games. This is not inaccurate per se, as UE4 was capable of making great-looking games and the industry at large were already familiar with UE3, but this was still very much the early days for this newest version, and widespread institutional knowledge just wasn't there yet. For further context, that same press release also proudly proclaimed that Yager were the first independent European studio to license the engine, so they were very much in uncharted waters. Sidebar, the first commercial UE4 game, Daylight, remember that one, wouldn't ship until around 13 months after this press release was issued. Now, any engine, from the most modest to the most robust, is simply a tool set, and developers always need time and resources to learn the various ins and outs. The fact of the matter is, while UE4 could technically handle any type of game, Epic had not specifically designed it with open-world demands in mind, which, along with its relative newness, posed a lot of problems for Dead Island 2, a lot of quickly. As Yager started to build these big, chunky open-world maps, performance started to suffer as a result, with former employees describing the PS4 and Xbox One versions as nearing the very edge of unplayable. This was then the perfect time for the team to receive what every developer hopes for: unrealistic mandates from the higher-ups. What happened shortly after the Greenlight demo was greenlit was the publisher came to us and said, "We want seamless multiplayer," and we're like, "Well, what does seamless multiplayer mean?" And they say, "Well, we don't really know. You figure it out." Around this time frame, there was a huge push for MMO-light games that blended both single and multiplayer together, and while this seemed to be what Deep Silver wanted, it took a while to realize exactly what that was, as titles like Destiny and The Division were still a decent ways off. This abrupt shift in scope obviously complicated matters several times over, as the team's approach to this included adding support for 8-player online co-op, which would have been quite the feat on UE4 in 2014. That also happened to be the year where Dead Island 2 was publicly announced, and knowing how effective the marketing was the first time around, Deep Silver shelled out for another glitzy CGI trailer. It wasn't as impactful as the first one, but you know, it was cute and fed into the over-the-topness of the gameplay a little better. During this media blitz, in an interview with ibtimes.uk, Deep Silver's Karsten Linder finally articulated what seamless multiplayer meant. There are no classic modes anymore. You start the game, you click on play, locate a server, and find players around you. It's like a very small MMO. You can just go and start whatever you want to do, a quest, an event, do something for your own, and then suddenly there's another player there and you can decide whether to team up or not. So yeah, a lot of lofty promises were being made, but behind the scenes the team were overwhelmed trying to deliver on them. So much so that one Yager employee interviewed by Game Informer shared that many on the team balked at the idea of a 2015 launch. There were people who were hopelessly optimistic about it and just going, yeah, shit, we'll just make it happen. The other half, I counted myself in that camp, we were just saying, yep, sure, let them get the marketing beat on it, get some pre-orders in, we're going to be a year out from there, easily. But even that generous estimation was a bit off, by another 2 development teams and about 8 more years. Deep Silver had scheduled Dead Island 2 for a spring 2015 release, but in the back half of 2014, the technical roadblocks started piling up. Yager apparently started missing major milestones, unable to deliver the game's large maps in a playable state on consoles. In the Game Informer article, one person described the PC version as pretty fun, but that the console versions just weren't able to load the game's assets fast enough to the point that you'd just be standing around waiting for major environment elements like buildings to even visibly appear. With Yager struggling to address all these problems, the big guns were called in to hopefully get Dead Island 2 back on track, as Epic offered direct support and resources to try to right the ship. They couldn't make much headway though, because the problem again was that on a fundamental level, UE4 simply wasn't built to make what Yager wanted, and especially not on machines like the PS4 and Xbox One, which featured lower spec CPUs and slow loading HDDs. Deep Silver then tagged in some Saints, who also happened to be engine architects, straight from Volition, to hopefully ascertain where they went wrong, which turned out to be from day one. According to a Yager employee, they looked at it and they're like, yeah, you need to build this shit from scratch. If that was true, we're like, oh fuck, it was a bit of a moment. I think the penny dropped with that, right? More external consultants were brought in afterwards, but the story was largely the same in the end. The build of the game they had was deemed impossible to ship with their current budget, headcount, and performance targets, and so Yager made the only choice they could, opting to compromise on their vision dramatically. They started by cutting the game's maps down into smaller, more manageable chunks, and dramatically pared back on the various multiplayer features to get where they needed the game to be. After only a few short months of going down this direction though, Deep Silver suddenly decided to cut their losses on the whole shebang and parted ways with Yager completely, saying in an official statement, "With Dead Island 2, Deep Silver has always been dedicated to delivering the sequel that Dead Island fans deserve. After careful consideration, today we announced the decision to part ways with development partner Yager." This obviously came as a bit of a shock to most on the team, including Timo Ullman, who in a dour quote to GamesIndustry.biz said, "Having a project cancelled in such a late state is a catastrophic event on so many different levels. It really is the worst possible outcome. Everybody involved loses." And Yager certainly did lose. If you'll recall, a whole sub-studio was formed just for Dead Island 2, and with no other project lined up on such short notice, the studio filed for insolvency in order to protect the majority of the staff and their future wages. While it's frustrating that Deep Silver felt the best answer here was to throw the zombie baby out with the bathwater, it's important to remember that game development is not always an exact science. And watching Deep Silver burn through a studio like this, only to gamble on another one afterwards, ain't the best look, to say the least. Dead Island 2 then entered its most mysterious development phase, where in March of 2016, Deep Silver enlisted Sumo Digital to hopefully finish it. At the time, Sumo seemed like a bit of an odd choice when taking a look at their back catalog, but they were making moves to become something other than the Sonic Racing studio. I reached out to current staff at Sumo to see if I could gain any insight into their time working on Dead Island 2, but was told that very few, if any, staff members who were involved remained at the studio. Deep Silver then made announcements in both 2017 and 2018, reiterating both times that Dead Island 2 was still on its way, but it very intensely wasn't, at least under Sumo. If I could hazard a guess here, among the several games Sumo was busy with at the time, it was perhaps the very infamous Crackdown 3, which would go on to have its own dynasty of delays, that may have caused further complications. This is guesswork on my part, but I can't help but wonder if this already massive open-world game bottlenecked Sumo so much that it caused Deep Silver to pack up and take the project elsewhere. Again. They, however, didn't have to look far before they landed on Dambuster Studios to help pick up the pieces, who have had such an interesting path through the industry that I may have to dedicate a whole video to them in the future. For now though, know that Dambuster were aware they hadn't quite nailed what they had set out to do with their previous title, Homefront: The Revolution, but were determined to put their all into their next project. So when they got the call to be the new developers of Dead Island 2, they saw it as both a hefty challenge but also an opportunity. This is because they had three things going for them that Yager did not. Unreal Engine 4 had matured greatly over the years and had become widely used amongst many studios. A dramatically beefier console generation was forthcoming, and finally, in a very rare bit of luck, Dambuster had already been working on an advanced gore rendering system named Flesh, fully locational evisceration system for humanoids, which could realistically render a ton of gory detail on characters as they suffered damage. I wonder what type of enemies that could be applied to. According to an IGN video, Dambuster's experience making Homefront: The Revolution had put them in a position where they felt they could execute on Dead Island 2. While they had access to previous builds of the game, they opted to more or less start from scratch while making some informed choices, such as dropping the other cities and focusing on just Los Angeles, and dividing it up into 10 different zones. Perhaps the most crucial thing, though, was shared by the game's creative director, James Worrell, to IGN, where he implied that Deep Silver had a better understanding on just how they themselves had failed the game in the past. Deep Silver were really keen to just give us the space to come up with what we wanted to do. This is in contrast to Yager being demanded to ship an elaborate 8-player always-online mini MMO, but then allowing Dambuster to ship a less ambitious but much safer 3-player co-op mode. All in all though, it seems that during this period Dead Island 2 went relatively smoothly, and when it was revealed at Gamescom 2022 to a rather shocked audience, as most had assumed it had long since been cancelled, they also announced a February 2023 release date. There was, of course, a slight delay into April, but I mean, that's a drop in the bucket when you consider this game's history. Dambuster's HR manager, Helen Haynes, also published a YouTube video last year, revealing that crunch had ended completely at Dambuster, something I also confirmed with a Dambuster employee I was able to speak to. I joined during the last year of development, so I wouldn't have the most extensive experience on the project. However, I can safely say the studio had a no crunch policy, which they followed. So during the 5-ish years the game was developed, there hasn't been any crunch. Outside of Dambuster though, Dead Island 2 clearly had a fairly heavy cost, changing hands between multiple studios with many staffers absolutely going through it along the way. It's rare for a game to be worked on and then torn away from such a wide group of people, and it speaks to a decade-long series of leadership failures from uncompromising upper management. Their choice to mindlessly follow industry standards by financially lowballing studios and burdening underfunded staff with sudden requests for elaborate and ambiguous online features, all alongside a willingness to completely pull the rug out from under them, cost many jobs and years of wasted work. While it's true the end result has been mostly positive, with Dead Island 2 receiving pretty solid reviews and even better commercial performance with 1 million copies sold during its first 3 days and a second million by the end of May, it took a lot of mistakes to get there. Speaking of which, now's about the time I loop back around on that big L I mentioned earlier. Techland's pitch for a more serious parkour-heavy zombie game that Deep Silver had passed on, which became Dying Light. It was picked up by Warner Bros. In 2015, where it went on to sell over 20 million copies across all formats as of the time of this writing. That, combined with its 2022 sequel, have completely dwarfed the lifetime sales of the entire Dead Island franchise. So, in terms of profitability, it seems that Techland's instinct to create a darker zombie-based horror game that truly embraced open-world design was in fact the correct one, as Deep Silver spent millions and millions of untold dollars correcting their mistakes over the course of a decade. With that said, even though we're only halfway through it, 2023 has already had its fair share of stinkers, and it's pretty incredible that a title as infamous as Dead Island 2 didn't wind up being one of them. But it's definitely bittersweet to see Deep Silver execs reaping the rewards in the end though, even proudly proclaiming that Dead Island 2 was the biggest launch in their entire history. Which, oh man, it means it finally topped their previous crown jewel, Right to Hell Retribution? Ah, jeez. Once again, props goes out to Blake Hester at Game Informer for his stellar reporting and his blessing to allow me to feature his article prominently in today's video. And if you've heard of any other shambling legends from across the video game or movie industries, do let me know in the comments below or enter the hellish ghoul-infested city that is my Twitter. See you next time, and thanks for watching!